Good morning, everybody. Welcome to seventh week here at the Oxford Union and the next instalment of our Smashing the Silos series, all about interdisciplinarity. And this week, all the fantastic events have been done in conjunction with the ICLE, that's the International Centre for Law and Economics. And thank you to Sam Bowman in particular and everybody else on there and who's helped put all these events together. The first conversation you'll be hearing today will be Charles Goodhart and Manoj Pradhan, who will be discussing any kind of relationships between demographics and growth. And thank you very much to both of them.
To start by talking about silos, since that's the main subject of this series, and I'm going to talk about silos in macroeconomics. Now, most forecasts have a 2-year horizon, not more, and that's actually very understandable because we are so little able to forecast the future and so many things that can happen that really going beyond 2 years, it's pretty much guesswork. But having such a short horizon means that longer term, slower moving trends tend to only get lip service. And that's particularly true of such factors as demography and globalization. And because these move so slowly that the models that are used really tend to ignore them altogether. And when the trends are continuing, that's actually pretty much okay. But when the trends are changing, that and reversing, that can bring about very serious difficulties. And in our book, we argue that the trends of both demography and globalization are changing very sharply. Another of the problems of economics is that we only have data on our historical experience, and a lot of things could have happened. So our data is simply one draw out of a whole series of alternative histories that might have occurred. And in any case, mankind is different from nature, the physical nature, in that we adapt to our experience. And that means that if we take a relatively short history, that is usually too short to be sure that what we're seeing is a regular and likely to be repeated phenomenon. Well, if we take a much longer period, indeed, if we have the data to take a much longer period, again, it's difficult to generate results from that, because over a long period of time, the way we do things will have changed, the context will have changed. So both short and long periods are quite difficult to work out exactly what has happened. So much so that macroeconomists have tended to move from looking at historical experience much more to axiomatic analyses, axiomatic arguments about the way that we behave, economic man, and what we try and maximize, for example. And again, there is a bit of a silo here. First of all, one of the features during my lifetime that I regret very much is that economic history has got separated from economics and regarded as a separate subject rather than a key element of macroeconomics as such. The other point is that the axiomatic approach to behavior that many macroeconomists and even microeconomists use doesn't tie very well with actual practical behavior. And indeed, there's a distinction between economics and psychology that is beginning to be overcome with the use of behavioral economics, but the application of behavioral economics with authors such as Kahneman, Tversky, and Richard Thaler has really only just started and hasn't gone far enough. Another area of silo is that rather like the drunk who looks for his keys under the light because that's where the data are, the data are all done by nation state, or almost all of them are done by nation state. And many economists focus inevitably and and obviously on the nation state in which they happen to be living. And the national focus has become much too narrow in a globalized world. The only area where the world as a whole tends to impinge on macroeconomics is through imports and exports. But there are a whole series of other areas, the implication, the impact of ideas, of technology, of inflation, and of interest rates is a very general area where the national focus has become far too narrow. Again, there has tended to be, over the recent decades, a envy of the laws of physics and a worship of mathematical technique. I think, if anything, that economics has chosen the wrong science to act as the template for what we would like. The science that we should have used as a template is much more biology, because mankind is an adaptive creature, and we adapt to our context, with the result that the way that we behave is continually changing, and that brings about a change in the context in which we're operating as a result also. Now, those are just some introductory remarks about silos in the case of macroeconomics. And now I want to go really very quickly through some of the issues of our book. And I'd like to start by just pointing out that looking at the monetary phenomena, the last 70 years have been very, very unusual. If you take the period since the foundation of the Bank of England at the end of the 17th century, you will see that actually long-term interest rates, particularly console yields, have remained remarkably stable, which means that that expectations of inflation, expectations of future short-term interest rates, and inflation itself have remained really very stable. Then from 1950 up to 1980, there was a very sharp rise in all those variables: inflation, short-term interest rates, inflationary expectations, followed by a collapse to the extraordinarily low levels of the present day. Now, since these were monetary phenomena, of course, there was a lot to do with the monetary regimes, with the gold standard, and with the fact that governments didn't spend much money in the earlier years except on wars, and wars were temporary and expected to be temporary. And particularly if you won the wars rather than you lost the wars, you went back to relatively prudent fiscal policies with relatively low expenditures, and inflation and interest rates returned back to normal. But the decline in inflation, which we've seen since the 1980s, although it was partly due to the much improved monetary policies, central bank independence and inflation targetry, that was not the only factor at work, as is evidenced by the fact that it actually wasn't all that difficult for central banks to bring about a lower inflation, in the sense that they were able to do this while introducing a trend decline in both short and long-term interest rates. And indeed, the underlying context was so disinflationary that from the great financial crisis of 2008-10 onwards, despite throwing the kitchen sink of expansionary policies at the problem, they have not been able to get inflation up to the target, which means there have been some very strong disinflationary forces. Now, we argue that these disinflationary forces are largely globalization and demography. In globalization, the key feature of the last period, the last decade since about 1990, has been the introduction of China and Eastern Europe into the world's trading system. If you look at the left-hand chart there, what you see is the blue line is the number of, in the working age population, available to those in the advanced economies of Europe, North America, Australia, and so on. And as you will see, it was rising, though not all that fast, during the periods from 1980 through to 2010. But at exactly the same time, the Chinese and Eastern European populations were joining the world's trading system. And China is huge, it's a quarter of the world's population. And it had very favorable demographics. And that population is shown by the yellow line. Now, once China and Eastern Europe had joined the world's trading system, it was open to any employer who could move their production of goods or even services to the low-wage centers of China and Eastern Europe to do so, which meant that the available labor force to manufacturers, particularly, and those with mobile production, more than doubled, because it was the blue line to begin with, and then it became the blue plus the yellow line. The chart on the right-hand side simply shows the increase in the workforce by region year by year. And you can see again how it was rising steadily to 2010. But note how after 2010, it reverses, with the exception of Africa and India, but primarily Africa, which we'll deal with at a later date. Now, I won't go into the reasons of how globalization brings about disinflation, but basically, if you join a low wage to a high wage area, you are bound to get more disinflation in the high wage sector area, but that is reinforced by demographics, because what we had demographically was a baby boom after World War II, which then, after about 10 to 15 years, turned around, and the net reproduction rate went way down, actually below the sustainable rate in most of our countries, below 2.1 per woman, to about 1.7 and 1.9. With the result that between 1970 and 2010, there was a massive decline in the proportion of young within our economies. And by then, the increase in the aged was only just beginning, so that the proportion in the working age population was actually rising significantly. That again is now reversing, because the proportion of old has now stabilized, while the number of the old has actually risen quite sharply. But it wasn't just that the number in the working age population was rising. It was with a decline in the number of children per women, and with the arrival of a range of consumer durables, washing machines, refrigerators, hoovers, whatever, it enabled a much larger proportion of the female population to actually become workers. So the participation rate within the working age population, particularly of women, increased very sharply. And that again is disinflationary. Essentially, workers produce, and the value of their production has got to be greater than the wage that you pay them. Otherwise, it wouldn't be worthwhile employing them in the first place. So workers are inherently disinflationary. Moreover, they have to save for their old age. So the proportion of workers in the population is disinflationary, whereas the young and the old consume, but they don't produce, so they're inflationary. And that is particularly true of the old within the population. And what is more, we are having an increasing problem of the old, because medicine has done wonderfully well at dealing with cardiovascular and cancer, but it has so far been totally unable to deal with the neurodegenerative diseases to which the old are particularly prone, Parkinson's and dementia in particular. you're very unlikely to get that kind of neurodegenerative disease and or arthritis or the other problems when you're below 60. And between 65 to 75, only about a third of the population have become medically dependent, needing care and support to undertake the activities of daily living. By the time you become old, 75 to 85, that rises to about 50%. Now, the old 85 plus, which is the fastest growing segment of the population at the moment, the percentage needing actual support, care, and a great deal of medicines are very high. Sort of nearly 80%. When you're 95 or so, it comes to about 100%. So the increase in the expectancy of life is wonderful in many ways, but it's going to be very, very expensive for us all if we're going to provide support for our aged population. And the fact that the old need to consume so much of medicine and care is represented in this diagram, where you see the more horizontal blue line. As you can see, the young really don't consume all that much apart from education. Then the consumption goes up, and it goes up as you get into retirement because of all the medical support, Medicare, Social Security, care, and so on. The old may not consume as much in the way of ordinary goods and services as those of working age, but they consume a great extra amount of medicines and social care. And that is going to be increasing by leaps and bounds over coming decades. I'm now going to turn over to Manoj, who's going to go quickly through the impact of these demographic and global factors on inequality.
Thank you, Charles, and thank you to all of you for giving us a chance to hosting us and giving us a chance to talk through our thesis. As Charles mentioned, what we've seen over the last 30 or 35 years is extraordinary. It's a once in history impulse to the labor force that has come about with the integration of these two formidable parts of the global labor force. And that actually, it was impossible for it not to have a global impact. So if you read Milanovic, he talks a lot about global inequality. And one of the points that he makes is global inequality was actually fairly steady until about 200 years ago, because everyone was performing at such an incredibly low level. And then the advanced economies, as they are today, tore ahead, propelled by things like the Industrial Revolution. And it's only in the last 30 or 35 years that things have changed. Now, this table, Charles and I agree, is probably one of the most striking bits of data in our book, because it tells you that just around 2000, the ratio of wages of an American worker to a Chinese worker was 35-1. Within a space of less than 20 years, that has come down to 5-1. That's a factor of 7. Such is the speed at which the integration of the Chinese workforce has taken place. You will remember that one of the first diagrams that Charles had presented to you with the blue and the yellow lines, the way you also want to further delve into that simple time series chart is to think that the blue line becomes effectively the blue plus yellow line, starting from the blue line and then going to the sum. So it's not just those two individual numbers, but the speed at which they integrated, which really drove a lot of this story. And that led to declining inequality globally. Emerging markets have done extremely well. The rise of China and India and North Asia, among others, has been spectacular. There has been progress in other economies also. So Eastern Europe over here, the spread between France and Poland has narrowed. But Poland, the Czech Republic, these are countries that had a pretty strong base to begin with. And hence the inequality wedge has closed at a much slower pace. The problem has been that the drive that China had in its investment combined with a low-cost labor force, as Charles said, which would tend to drive global inflation down, ended up impacting that part of the labor force, which was in direct competition with the Chinese worker. So what you saw, this is a chart from Auteur, is the part of the manufacturing sector that was effectively shipped over to China, and there's a very good paper from two Federal Reserve economists called The Surprisingly Swift Decline of US Manufacturing Employment. It's a mouthful, but it tells you the story very, very well in the title. What that tells you is that it's the jobs that were protected by tariffs that went over to China. And as a result, over the last 30 or 35 years, or even more following Auteur, the story of globalization, which begins in 1979 from China's reforms, really drives a big wedge within economies and makes inequality worse. And that, of course, has led to populism and all of the problems that we've seen politically along with that. But the one issue that could not have been driven down, no matter what happened, is how we look after the elderly and how the state, what role the state plays in something Charles alluded to. And for that, I'm going to turn it right back to him now.
And the problem is that aging, with its medical implications, has and will lead to very severe fiscal problems because the health and social security and care is very largely provided by the government. And the point that I want to make is that the fiscal problems that we now face are really virtually nothing to do with COVID, which is the pandemic, which is just, if you like, an added bump along a road in which we were already progressing. And I want to emphasize that this chart is consciously taken from before anyone had any idea about COVID. It comes from the Office of Budget Responsibility in the UK, and the purple lines are the underlying deficits, which include a very large primary deficit. This is not all interest rate payment by any means at all. The primary deficits on present policies were always going to be increasing, and this OBR paper was published in 2019, taking it up to 2018. And you can see that because of the continuing primary deficits, the public sector debt ratio continues remorselessly and indeed exponentially upwards. The same actually is true of the US. And here we've got a later figure from 2020, August 2020, from the Congressional Budget Office. And the pandemic is shown, and that actually is a sort of a bulge in a continuously upward sloping debt ratio. It's going to be an upward sloping debt ratio again, because the primary deficits, given the expenditures, again on Social Security, Medicare, and medicines, will mean that we got a significant fiscal problem of ever rising debt. Now, this was not true in the past. People used to take some comfort from the fact that the debt ratio we've got now is not as high as the debt ratio that we had after World War II, and in the UK in particular after the Napoleonic Wars. But I would re-emphasize what I said earlier. Those wars were temporary, and after the wars were over, there were very good reasons for expecting that things would return to normal, there would be balanced or surplus budgets, inflation would remain low, and everything would come right. The problem with the present is that the cause of the underlying fiscal problems is demographic, the aging of the vast majority of our major economies, including those that were fastest growing. So what's actually going to happen, given this apparently inexorable rise in public deficits, public sector deficits, and debt? So what what are we going to do? What's the end game? What's going to happen? Well, the nicest way of dealing with the debt problem is to grow out of it. And if your growth is much faster than your interest rates, then the economy and tax receipts and all of that are growing faster than interest rates. Interest payments are rising the debt. The problem is that the very same reversal of the working age population is going to mean the growth is very unlikely to remain as high as it is at the moment. And it's been actually rather disappointingly low, because growth is a combination or a function of the growth in the working age population, the number of workers you have, interacting with the productivity increases that those workers can bring to bear. Now, we're going to get a sharp decline, particularly in continental Europe and China, which have been some of the fastest growing areas. In order to maintain growth, even at present levels, productivity would have to rise very, very sharply. Now, we do believe that productivity will rise, in part because with the reversal of the globalization, the American-China dispute, the protectionist tendencies of the modern age, driven on in some part by the pandemic. For example, Italy refusing to send vaccines to Australia, that sort of thing. There's going to be a shift to onshoring away from offshoring. And in order to offset the decline in the number of workers, the companies in these countries will invest more and productivity will rise. Nevertheless, growth is likely to be, for demographic reasons, rather slow. That means that we have to deal with the primary deficits in some very large part by either reducing the support for the old, which I would not be in favor of, or by raising taxes. And there are some taxes I think that could be raised, but the problem is that increases in taxes, almost any taxes, are extremely unpopular. Virtually every economist you ever meet will say that a carbon tax is the right solution. But remember what difficulties Macron had with the Gilets jaunes. Even the introduction of carbon taxes will be very difficult politically to do. Now, if you can't do that, how about trying to deal with the inflation problem by raising interest rates? But the problem with raising interest rates is that our debt is so high that it would cause both fiscal problems and problems of solvency in the private sector. So with monetary policy constrained, fiscal policy constrained by the unpopularity of taxation and growth limited, we think that inflation is going to be the inevitable result, unattractive but necessary. And that will probably continue until it becomes either so high or has become so politically undesirable that actually raising taxes becomes a better alternative. Now, one of the things we did not touch on in our book, partly because you can't touch on everything, is climate change and the green lobby and the environmental focus. One point that we would make is that the need to reduce upwards pressure on temperature through various green measures will in the short run lead to considerably extra demand, which in turn will be inflationary. Now, when we started writing this book before the COVID pandemic occurred, we realized that although the trends in demography and globalization had reversed, the effect of all the earlier disinflationary pressures had so weakened trades unions and labor bargaining power that it would take quite a long time for the reversal of these trends to bring about a restoration of labor power as a result of the reduced supply of labor relative to demand. And we were very unclear in our own minds within about 5 or 10 years when this might have an effect. But we now think that the implications of the COVID pandemic, in particular, the policies that have been put in place, notably the Biden stimulus, and also the very sharp increase in the monetary aggregates, will lead to inflationary pressures becoming more immediate. Not, of course, until the vaccines really have taken effect and we can get a return to normality. But we think that there will be a quicker and more persistent rise in inflation than the general run of mainstream economists have thought up to the present. But we're still very much in a minority. And I want to turn over again to Manoj to describe some of the reasons why we are in such a minority.
Thank you very much, Charles. I'll walk you through the critiques that we have received as far as our thesis is concerned, and then conclude. Broadly, the critiques that we get can be put into 5 buckets. I won't spend a whole lot of time on each of them. I'll spend a little bit more time on Japan because it speaks to the theme of the series, which is smashing silos. But the first one, if you remember, Charles, one of Charles's earlier few charts that I had referenced before, with that blue line on the advanced economies and yellow lines for China and China and Eastern Europe, you also had the sneaky little gray dashed line that was streaking upwards, and that was Africa. If you combine Africa and India and parts of Latin America, actually the numerical demography that you see in the world is not that bad. But there are 3 problems associated with depending on Africa and India to bail us out in an economic sense. First is, as Charles said, the majority of global growth is now coming from countries that have their dependency ratios turning against them. And in some senses, if you look at the wonderful work that the World Bank has done, what they do is they look at countries and split them into countries that have already received the demographic dividend, countries that have not received their demographic dividend and yet are in waiting. And they've shown you that those population pressures, the pressure of administrations to provide jobs from younger people, is probably part of the reason that the advanced economies and China grew very rapidly. Because if they did not, the administrations would face the kind of pressure that we've seen in the Arab Spring to find people jobs, and the kind of pressure that someone in New Delhi faces when there are 170 million young people going to the polls every 5 years. If you don't get them jobs, you don't have a job. The problems associated with really them bailing the world out are very different. So we have no doubt that Africa and India are going to do very well. But if you look at Africa as a continent, we're not talking in a social sense, but we're talking in an economic sense. There is an issue that Africa is a set of 50 countries with a population the same size as India. But that means they have 50 different national interests, 50 different national policies, 50 different sets of national regulations. So even if a third of Africa has better ease of doing business standards than even China, to get the continent and India to work collectively as if it was a well-oiled machine like China seems incredibly difficult to us. In other words, what they lack severely is administrative firepower, administrative capital, and that's something China never really had to worry about. For most of history, as Charles mentioned, China has been the dominant economy in the world. And so they've got a history of guilds, of trainee programs, of internships, and basically just diffusion of technology throughout the system that allowed them to infuse those grassroots level work ethics and workforces along with national policy. And so seamlessly, they were able to take capital from the advanced economies, turn that into output, and ship it back to the advanced economies. We think Africa and India will do very well relative to their own histories, but whether they're able to come back and perform like China is something that we doubt. The other thing, of course, you could do is you could take labor directly from these countries and bring them over to the advanced economies to help look after the elderly. After all, not all such jobs require very high skills, and there is an abundance in labor. But really, under these current regimes of immigration, to us, that seems like an almost Herculean task. It seems far more practical to think that there might be a transformation in Africa and India that allows them to really grow very rapidly, though we don't assign a very high probability to this. The next three are kind of mixed together. So the general argument is, look, why not limit the benefits to the old, get the elderly to participate more? And the third one, just kind of infused in this, what about technology? What role does this play in here? So I'll talk about the first of those two very quickly. Well, to an extent, the elderly have already participated significantly, and that's been because you have reduced their pension benefits. So all these lines that you see streaking upwards may be partly because of the increased participation of women that Charles spoke about, but also in many of these countries, particularly you see that orange line in New Zealand and Germany, what you've seen is participation has risen when pension benefits have been reduced. And so if the pre-retirement cohort of workers is already showing you 70, 75% participation, how much more are you going to get? So you've already picked the low-hanging fruit. Squeezing more juice out of that rock seems very difficult to do. As far as technology is concerned, yes, it can help. Of course it can help. The question is how much? We don't think that technology can look after the elderly directly. Charles and I both have very personal experiences with issues of caring for people with neurodegenerative diseases in our families. And we can tell you very confidently that the technology that we have on offer today is not capable of looking after the elderly. So robots taking over from humans doesn't seem possible. In fact, there's a paper on nursing homes in Japan, which tells you exactly that when these mini robots are utilized for simplistic purposes or very simple tasks to help nurses, they're able to help perform the task better, but it does not reduce the number of nurses that are required in here, which means we need technology to destroy jobs in other parts of the economy. If you don't have immigration and robots can't look after the elderly, then we are going to have to increasingly move people over from other parts of the economy to help with the caring progress. So technology has a very important role, but unfortunately it does not do what most people expect it to do, which is allow the economy to run out of jobs. We think rather it's going to run out of workers. And finally, why didn't this happen in Japan? If the story is so complete as we argue and a viable alternative to conventional thinking as we think it is, why didn't we see any of this in Japan? We can take some of this in the Q&A, but in the interest of time, I'll make a short comment here, which is that look, Japan's not an economy that's working in autarky. In fact, to the point of smashing silos, one of the problems in the analysis of Japan has been that it has been viewed as an economy in autarky. So people have looked at Japan's waning demography. They've looked at low growth. They've looked at deflation over some parts, mild inflation in others, and falling interest rates, and said, well, the two must be connected. But they need not be. In a globalized world, we have to wonder why Japan could resist what China was delivering all over the world. Japan had no way to stop the disinflation that Charles spoke about, the falling trend of falling interest rates that Charles also spoke about. And that's exactly what happened in Japan. So we think rather than this being a function of Japan's demography, it is something that the world and Japan imported from China. In fact, if you look at that lower left-hand side chart, what this tells you is that the picture of Japan that was painted, particularly for the corporate sector, as being weighed down by the burden of debt, falling corporate debt leading to a very soporific performance from the Japanese corporate sector, is actually not true. What the Japanese corporate sector saw was what all of us have seen, which is the dramatic rise of China. And they invested heavily, they employed people heavily, and they manufactured heavily abroad. So Japan's an entirely different animal, and we've got an entire chapter devoted to just how it's done. Anyone who's interested in that, I would strongly urge you to take a look at that, because it is a completely revisionist history based on brand new data that we're very proud of. And finally, to conclude, inflation's coming. What happened in the post-financial crisis era is that central banks gave money to financial institutions. Financial institutions needed to protect their balance sheet, so they did not lend. In fact, you needed programs like funding for lending to try and incentivize banks to lend. Today, the surge of policy intervention has been led by fiscal policy, which has given money directly to households and to companies who will spend. The yield curve will steepen. If many of you paid attention to Jay Powell's speech over this last week, you will have noticed that he doubled down on the guidance from the Federal Reserve not to raise interest rates for a while, and that led to a very sharp jump in bond yields. Because central banks are not standing in the way of this rapid growth, and it opens the door for inflation. In fact, if central banks were to come in and control yields, we think that would mean that real bond yields become much lower as inflation expectations rise, and that would have been a pro-cyclical policy. Structurally, this would mean asset returns are harder to extract in a period of low growth, rising inflation, and higher debt. The good news is that lower within country inequality will be something that helps the social structure, but in a slightly more difficult way, because it's not happening with rapid growth, it's happening with slowing growth. And finally, something that Charles is by far an authority on, one of the points we make in the book is that over the last 30 or 35 years, central banks have been the best of friends with finance ministers. But if central banks now have to face rising inflation rather than falling inflation, we really wonder whether their independence will be protected as it has been in the past. But that's it from me. Thank you.
Thank you both. That was a really, really fascinating presentation. And I think you've probably touched on more topics than we're going to be able to adequately cover in the Q&A. So apologies to everyone in the audience if we don't get to all of the points you've raised. I guess maybe just picking up from that last point you made, Manoj, one of the things I'd be really curious to explore with you both is the future of central bank independence. You know, the traditional economic history of the last 30 years doesn't attribute the end of inflation to demographics, but rather to central banks coming along and being clever, and that's been the legitimating ideology behind central banks not having lots of political oversight. But right now we're seeing half of the central bank governors of the world trying to smash the silos of what they're allowed to talk about and go off into whether it's Green New Deal ideas or equality or gender politics. And then at the same time, there's maybe going to be this driver for more political oversight. So really curious to get your thoughts on how that plays out over the next 5, 10, 15 years.
Well, you shouldn't necessarily assume that all central banks are going to be similar. The ECB, the European Central Bank in particular, has its independence protected by treaty, whereas all the other central banks are effectively, their independence is a creature of the legislature, and what one legislature can do, another can undo. Moreover, the governments normally appoint the central bank governors, and they can sort of choose who they want. And they can make life very difficult for central banks if they want to do so. And the argument that we're making is that if and when inflation rises and central banks start to raise interest rates in order to counter that, then this will be very difficult for government on the fiscal side. And it could also lead to financial difficulties. There's a very extended asset prices that we see at the moment would then reduce, possibly even collapse at various times. So the ministers of finance are likely to put great pressure on central bankers not to raise interest rates very much or very fast. And indeed, some central bank governors are already saying that they don't want to do it anyhow. And having undershot for so many years, they're now prepared to have a period of overshooting. The question is, how much will they tolerate and for how long? And will, after there is a possible, I would think, probable blip in inflation when normality returns, will inflation go back to target, of which the central bankers at the moment seem to be relatively confident. We don't share that confidence.
Maybe there's a parallel question. I can ask, which is less focused on what happens to central banks over the next 10 to 15 years and more what happens to our idea of what a working age population looks like. Because I think a lot of the thinking we've all done so far has been based on the idea that 65 is old, and that after that point you can't do a lot of serious work. And whether it's robots coming in and enabling the elderly to continue to do supervisory jobs inside warehouses, whether it's the smashing of the silos of office work that's been enabled by technologies like Zoom during this pandemic. Should we actually be thinking about 85 as the new old? And while you have people bleed out of the workforce on the basis of age, the idea that after 65 you can't be a productive worker, is that something that we should jettison in the next 10 to 15 years?
I think yes. In certain fields, I would completely agree with you. In certain areas of work, I think I would completely agree with you. For example, what Zoom has allowed people to do is not have the burden of location impinge upon them, and not have really a set limit about what you can do from where. And the other thing it has done is it has forced companies to unpackage many of the processes they had in the past, and push them in a way that can be digitally transformed. Now, this has a couple of impacts. Number one is you could be thinking, well, this is wonderful. I can work for as long as I want. The other problem is the other guys are thinking, well, if my job cannot be protected by my intellectual firewalls, if you will, could someone in Budapest or New Delhi do my job equally well? If I am working from home, why should that stop any more globalization of at least my task? So depending on a sector where these things are possible, we can have all kinds of impacts. But what I'm trying to get at is that there is also a scale for which such substitutions can happen. I think these substitutions, we discuss them all too well because they're mental work, and mental work really has no limits. When it comes to physical work, yes, there has been some help. For example, in Japan, there have been significant developments on exoskeletons that can help workers, and now those are being used for the elderly. And one of my favorite examples used to be, though, just to show you the limits of how they can go, Japan had the first completely roboticized hotel in the world, and the receptionist was a velociraptor. 2 years from the start, 50% of the robots have unfortunately been fired and replaced by humans. It's not because of labor union problems, certainly not because of robot scarcity, but because robots did not have the ability to be flexible enough to answer all the queries that came their way. So there's still a lot of work that needs to be done over here. I don't think we should take for granted that technology or robotics can do pretty much anything. If you go back to the last 30 or 40 years, both Charles and I have been in academia, and we've heard many times that, well, basically you won't need classrooms anymore. Part of the reason that the people call US healthcare inefficient is because it hires so many people relative to the services it performs. But there are some services that require human care because they're so idiosyncratic. I don't think we're yet at the stage where robots can take over. Maybe they could after 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. I don't think we're there anywhere close to it right now.
It strikes me that one of the underpinnings of your thinking there around why the elderly are going to be limited in their ability to live differently from how they've lived in the last 30, 40 years is that neurodegenerative disease point. That stripping that back, everything else points to someone who's healthy in their late 70s probably can be considered part of the active labour force going forwards in a way that they couldn't hitherto. And it is that forced exit from the labour force in the baby boom that will turn this corner for us, whether that happens in 5 years or in 15. Is that fair?
I think that's entirely fair. And if you look at it, there are two parallel aspects to it that you should take into account. Number one is the state looking after you. For example, in Japan, the study on nursing homes was possible because the Japanese government provides a subsidy to experiment with robotics because they do take care of the elderly. In the United States, only a small part of dementia is given coverage under Medicare. In the UK, there's only a certain category of the elderly who suffer from dementia who have to qualify for public health. So if the government is giving you health, then government debt goes up. If the government is not giving you health, these people still need looking after, and typically it's family members who do it. And if there's family members who do it, they can't participate in the labor force. So no matter where you go, the silos get smashed themselves, if you will. There's no single way to go in which you can solve every problem.
We would love it if we were wrong, because medicine comes up with a cure to dementia and to Parkinson's. We very much hope that occurs. But the problem is you cannot actually set policy on the expectation and hope that this is going to be achieved. But we would love it. Our outlook is not all that optimistic about the effects of an aging world, and we very much hope that we're wrong. We very much hope that technology really does develop very much faster. We very much hope that medicine will deal with dementia. But until that occurs, we feel that our story is something that people have got to be aware of.
Yeah. Do you mind if I take a step back from drilling into the thesis and ask more of a meta question around the way it's all framed? One of the things that really struck me from the book was the way that you brought in both demographics, but also a look at the actual diseases of old age to bear on these questions. And I think you mentioned right at the start that the structure of the discipline, looking at national state level data, was one of the things that limited macroeconomics' ability to really think in the modern world. I suppose I'm curious, not just to get a sense from you of what variables other than demographics and disease have been neglected by macroeconomics, but also how we can potentially solve that challenge for the discipline, whether there are problems involved in the way that macroeconomics serves an audience of more short-term focused financial forecasters that drives the field more and more into shorter term models, and whether there's a way of solving it there, or if you see the problem arising from a different quarter.
Well, as I said really at the outset, I think we've got the wrong science as our sort of template. Our template ought to be biology, with adaptation to context and changing the context through our adaptation, rather than physics. And at the moment, we think in terms of equilibria, we think in terms of dynamic effects. What we ought to be thinking of in terms of adapting to events, leading to changes in the underlying structure of our system, which again leads to further adaptations. Essentially, there is no such thing as an equilibrium that is going to remain constant over time. It's always changing. And in some ways, Keynes's animal spirits was just the right idea, because again, it was biological rather than coming out of physics. And if you like, the life sciences, behavior, psychology, medicine, and again, as Manoj said rightly, and I think one of the things that we're proud about is bringing in some of the medical issues into our view about the future of the macroeconomic system. Very, very rarely done.
I suppose the curiosity is why isn't it done more often? And that's where I'm curious to think, if you were trying to structure anything over the next 5 to 10 years to make it easier for economists to think about the world through those lenses, are there obstacles that we can remove, or is it just a case of a field that's lacked curiosity? Surely not.
Difficult question, that. One's always subject to one's own experience. I would certainly like to see more economic history reinstated as part of the subject. I applaud the development of behavioral economics. I think that trying to have a greater interrelationship with the biological sciences life sciences rather than the natural sciences is probably the way to go. But I don't know that I've properly answered your question. I'm not sure that I can.
It's really is a very tough question to answer. The only nugget of information that I can give you by looking at the last decade after the financial crisis is there was almost an existential search within the academic and financial community about how everyone from financial markets to policymakers to academics had missed the great financial crisis. And that led to a fairly large effort to integrate finance more aggressively into economics. But this happened successfully in some places, but unsuccessfully in others. And let me just tell you the way I saw it, because I was transitioning from an academic to financial world. And so I saw these things firsthand to some extent. And what I saw were these DSG models that they had in the past were tweaked with a finance element to it. But the kind of transformation that Charles talks about, which is that, look, let's reorganize the entire science as a whole and see if we can go back to not just an economics drawing board, but a drawing board of life. That happened in very few places. It did happen. There were a lot of people who brought in how families behave and what the social impact of this change has been. Some of that did take place, but it did not happen at a level that influenced macroeconomic policy. Similarly, I don't think the financial world really took on. I mean, if you look at financial markets, and I look at when I speak to my clients and I talk to almost everyone there is to talk to, I think they do pay lip service to inequality. I shouldn't say lip service. They do pay attention to inequality. I think that happens more and more, but there are very few people who really integrate it into their thinking. Even this prevalence of ESG, environmental social governance factors, which has become such a mantra. In most places, it's simply a box ticking exercise. So I don't think it's a problem with just the theory or just the academic side of the world. I think all parts of this world think they have gotten something right and are not very happy to point the finger entirely at themselves. I think there is some of that going on. We hope that will change.
Thank you. I'm aware that there are at least 4 or 5 other audience questions we haven't had the chance to get onto, and I can only apologize to them, but I'm aware that we're coming up towards the end of time. So I just want to say thank you to both of you, Charles and Manoj, for taking the time to do this. And also just remind people in the audience that if they want to join the 2 p.m. talk by Catherine Tucker, who's going to be asking about whether there's a trade-off between privacy and innovation, they're going to need to register in advance, because that's the only way we can make sure these Zooms are properly secure. But with that said, look, thank you again. That's been really interesting and a lot of food for thought there.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.